Hey there everyone, my name is Jakejames Lugo and welcome to the channel. So let's finally talk about Final Fantasy X. I've wanted to talk about this game for quite some time because I have a real resonance with it. I mean, if you can't already tell, I'm kind of a big fan of Final Fantasy X. This was a game that I just played at the right time back when it first came out, and there's just so much to discuss about it, so let's just stop dilly-dallying around and just dive right into this. Get comfortable though, because this might be a little bit longer than usual, but let's finally get started. Final Fantasy X was originally released on the PlayStation 2 back in 2001 by Square Enix, better known back then as Squaresoft. It's the first game of the series to have fully voiced dialogue and cutscenes, which was a huge deal at the time. Before this, the PlayStation Final Fantasy titles were massive games that introduced cinematic cutscenes atop pre-rendered backdrops and environments. Final Fantasy X was the turning point for the series that implemented fully rendered 3D environments that you could explore, even if they were a bit linear than most other entries of the series. Fun fact, it was around this time that Squaresoft was also working on other Final Fantasy games that would eventually make a significant impact, specifically Final Fantasy XI, which brought the series into the MMO realm. It took a few years to develop, but Final Fantasy X was eventually released to a good critical reception. It received a lot of high scores and reviews from various gaming outlets, calling it the best Final Fantasy title at the time. Later in 2015, Final Fantasy X got an HD re-release for the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation Vita, which would also make its way over onto the Nintendo Switch. I've played through this game a few times over the years, and I've always felt that it got a very bad rap from a lot of JRPG purists. But are the criticisms about Final Fantasy X really justified? Or is this actually one of the more underrated entries of the series?
This is it. This is your story. It all begins here.
Now, the version of the game that I'm using for this review is the HD version that comes with Final Fantasy X-2 HD Remaster. This is the best that the game has looked to date. Even back then, however, the game still looked very good. It was the best as far as like the series for that time frame, especially coming off Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. Now, granted, this game has aged significantly, but even then with its age, it still looks pretty darn good, especially with the kind of cleaned up visuals that you get from the HD Remaster. One thing that is a shame, however, is the lower textures and some of the environments that are kind of blah, even for back then on the PlayStation 2, they still are kind of blah in the HD Remaster. There's not really a lot of work done to them, or as far as like making them much more higher quality, or making them any more significantly better than what they already were back then. It's just kind of meh, but even so, as far as the character models, as far as like the bigger set pieces and other stuff that's much more important to the visuals, those are actually pretty darn good. And of course, we have to talk about the music. I mean, just listen to this. Now granted, that's the original version of that music, and here's the HD one because, man, listen to this! I'm telling you, man, this music is fantastic. It's something that not a lot of people really talk about when it comes to this game, but anyway, let's get into some of the other aspects of Final Fantasy X, more specifically, the story. The story of Final Fantasy X is divisive amongst fans. Some people like it, others outright hate it, and I can honestly see both sides of the argument here. But while I feel it has its silly and overall dumb moments,
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore. You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
I don't think the story is flat out terrible. So what's the big deal here? Final Fantasy X takes place in a world known as Spira. It follows a young boy named Titus. He's a blitzball player that's a real goofball. It's really because of this guy that a lot of people seem to really dislike this game, blaming his unrelatable personality and genuine stupidity in some cases. I can't lie, he's definitely not as well written or relatable as other Final Fantasy heroes, but I don't personally hate him as much as other people do. Anyway, Titus plays a sport known as blitzball in his home city of Zanarkand as a star player for the Zanarkand Abes. One night during a big game, a mysterious force comes out of the sea and attacks the city. During the assault, Titus is saved by his friend Orin while the city is completely destroyed. Everything is engulfed into a massive vortex, and Titus is flung 1,000 years into the future. He's eventually discovered by a group of mercenaries known as the Albed, led by a girl named Riku. It's here that he learns what destroyed his home was something known as Sin. Sin is a giant deity that causes suffering to all of the people in Spira. It attacks violently and randomly all over the planet. After some more craziness, Titus ends up on Besaid Island and meets up with Waka, Lulu, Kamari, and a beautiful summoner girl named Yuna. He finds out more about Sin's history and Yuna's pilgrimage to destroy Sin and save Spira. Because of this, Titus decides to accompany Yuna and her allies on her pilgrimage in hopes of learning more about Sin and hopefully finding a way back home. Unbeknownst to him, however, he has a stronger connection to Sin than he realizes. I won't get into much more beyond that, but there's plenty of other twists and turns that takes the group all over Spira. Everything comes full circle for a climactic finale that will tug at a few heartstrings. There's even more beyond that, including some colorful characters you meet along the way. Personally, this was a somewhat decent story that gave us a new setting to explore within the Final Fantasy universe. But to others, however, it was a step backwards from the typical norm. Alright, I admit that certain elements of this story is kind of meh and very one-dimensional, specifically with certain characters that people have a big problem with. However, the themes of death and some of the other centralized themes and stuff that's really guiding the narrative along, I feel like is on par with what we got from some of the PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy games. This is actually a really dark story. This really goes into some super serious territory that I guess either a lot of people forgot over the years or just don't really pay attention to it as much compared to some of the other games that a lot of people praise. But I still give it credit for being not only, ballsy enough to go that dark with its narrative and a lot of its characters, but also discuss some really difficult subject matter, including death, including genocide, including the refusal to die, or at least, the refusal of the natural order of things. There's a lot of big centralized stuff in here that I feel like should get at least, some shine. Some of my favorite characters are Waka and as well as also Seymour and Orin. Waka I feel like has the best growth, especially with the way that he looks and sees things in the world. A lot of his philosophies and believing in Yu Yevon and all this other stuff. And the same thing with Orin, which I feel like, he goes through a huge big transition compared to when we actually see him at the beginning of the game and right up to the point where we see him at the end of the game, which I won't spoil. It actually hits a few good, emotional, heartstrings. Again, even talking about it, I get all messed up. It's just again, there's so much that happens with it that I feel like if you haven't experienced it, you really need to do so. And then of course, like I mentioned, Seymour, which I feel like is a great villain. Granted, a lot of people like him much more for his looks and other stuff, but his backstory and some of the things he's involved with that, in relation to the plot and some of the big themes of the story, I think are actually pretty good. Granted, he's no Kefka, he's no Sephiroth, but I still feel like he still has some good elements to him that more people need to recognize. Anyway, let's get into some of the gameplay stuff, which I feel like is super important because there is a lot to unpack with it. First, let's start off with the exploration, moving around the maps and stuff and the environment of Final Fantasy X, which is the world of Spira. What is that like? After playing this game so many times, I really believe Final Fantasy X is one of the easiest games out of all the numbered titles in the series. Some people might feel differently about that, and I get it, but I find that the exploration, customization, and the combat of the game to be pretty streamlined. Square did a great job rendering the environments and adding a few extra places for you to discover, even though most of the game is very linear for a long time. Once you progress through about a third of the story, things start to open up much more, but it definitely does feel very restricted for a long time. When you finally get the airship to explore Spira, that's when you'll have plenty of breathing room to revisit locations and hop all over Spira. Unfortunately, you can't roam around on the world map like other Final Fantasy games, which is a bummer. Discovering hidden codes and solving a couple puzzles opens up a few hidden areas that lead to cool rewards and some dangerous areas for you to conquer. Now, I should mention there are some big issues with traveling around Spira, especially in the earlier parts of the game, where you just don't have a lot of access to different things. Granted, you're visiting areas mostly for the first time, but even then, accessing the airship later on, or being able to go to different locations from the save spheres that you visit, as far as, wherever they're laid out throughout all the different maps, there's a lot of little things, especially quality of life stuff, that I felt like could have been made much better, especially with the HD remaster version, but for what it is, it's kind of average. It could be a little bit better. The other thing too I want to talk about are the underwater sections, which I think are terrible. The underwater sections, especially controlling Titus and the amount of party members you have access to when you have to go underwater, is kind of crappy. I mean, you only get access to Titus, Waka, and Riku. I mean, at that point, unless you have those characters enabled with magic, or at least have some sort of magic abilities, you're going to have no access to any of your summons, any of your black magic, some of your white magic. That's a real bummer, to be honest with you. Of course, besides the exploration, we also do have to talk about like some of the leveling and some of the customization stuff, which for Final Fantasy X was very different than some of the other games that we got beforehand. Leveling up and customizing your characters is done through the sphere grid. You get experience from completing battles and using the levels you gain to move on the grid with each party member. The more experience you get, the more moves you can do on the grid. This is very different from traditional leveling in Final Fantasy, but it gives you some options in how you want your characters to grow. Placing spheres in different nodes can unlock new abilities and stat bonuses for the entire party. It's a straightforward system that influenced future Final Fantasy games years afterwards, but it's also one that I feel many people overly criticize. Yes, I'll admit that I would rather take traditional leveling over this one, but I do feel that its simplicity and different approach to leveling is what makes the sphere grid so interesting. There is definitely some micromanagement in here if you really want to take advantage of the perks that each character can obtain, so if that's a big turnoff to you, then I understand why you might not like this. But I think going back to the sphere grid and moving around each character along the grid isn't as bad as people make it out to be. At some point, you could completely fill out the grid with each character, but that won't happen until the late game. Bottom line, if you like your RPG systems to be simple and not too complicated, then the sphere grid works out pretty well. You could see almost the same thing implemented into games like Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XV, and Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, I like the sphere grid. I think that some people are just way too harsh on this thing, because I think it's just simple to get into and mess around with, especially towards the late game. However, one thing I do agree with everybody is that the equipment stuff that you get throughout the entirety of the game, they're not as important as like some of the stuff that you get with the sphere grid. The only real importance that you get from equipment, especially weapons and like shields and stuff, is that you could equip different types of abilities that prevent status elements, give you those auto abilities that are really helpful in the late game. Like, that's the reason why you're going to want to actually mess around and customize that stuff. However, again, certain abilities are really going to take priority over others, and you're not really going to care about the majority of the stuff that is at least available to you. This is all stuff that becomes much more important towards the later portions of the game, right before you go to the final battle. I feel like once you get to that point, you start to really see a lot of more interesting stuff and be able to mess around both with the sphere grid and also like the different equipment customizations. Earlier on in the game, like towards the middle half or even like the first 3/4 of it, you're not really going to care as much. Okay, now let's get into the battles proper, you know, the actual combat of Final Fantasy X, which again, some people really like, some people really hate. Personally for me, I like it, but for a couple different reasons. Now, battles is where I feel this game really shines. For whatever reason, people harp on this game being easy, and I completely disagree with that. If you've played through Final Fantasy X to the end, then you know that there are certain fights that are really tough. Combat is done through a turn-based format, but there's no active time battle systems here. You can actually take your time and see what turns are coming up as you play through a battle. However, what I like about Final Fantasy X's battles is how the game allows you to swap in and out of characters for almost any occasion, utilizing the whole party in different ways. Everyone fulfills a certain role for the group, kind of like the classes in older Final Fantasy titles. Certain characters excel at defeating certain types of enemies efficiently. For example, Titus can take down enemies that are very quick moving, such as wolves and lizards. Waka, on the other hand, can attack flying enemies that others can't reach. Yuna and Lulu are your white and black mage users respectively for all of your magic and summoning needs, and Auron can pierce through the armored enemies with his giant sword. This is cool because some enemies won't even last a few turns because you're attacking them with the right character at the right time, which is great for leveling and item grinding. The big exceptions here are obviously Kimahri and Riku. They are the utility characters for various situations. Riku can use items and create effects with them that aren't available to others early on, while Kimahri is more like the blue mage that can learn attacks from enemies and use them against them. Believe it or not, a lot of the traditional beats from previous games get filled out here, which is pretty neat. So let me be real with you guys. I actually like the combat of Final Fantasy X. I think it harkens back to some of the older games without getting too caught up on some like newer systems or really trying to implement the active time battle system that you saw in 7, 8, and 9. I feel like this was the right move for Squaresoft at the time. Remember, this was a Final Fantasy game that was jumping console generations. It was coming from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2. So even though I feel like they kind of focused much more on the visuals and the presentation of the game, I still feel like they at least, figured out enough well, at least based off of older games, for the combat system for it to translate well between console generations. This is something that a lot of people could have easily just dived into and really just focus on the spectacle that was around them. Now, of course, I have to be honest here. There's a couple things about the combat that I do not like, specifically a few boss battles which I feel like are just way too difficult, or they like have these huge spikes in difficulty out of nowhere compared to the rest of the game. So with all that being said, let me actually talk about something that I feel like doesn't get talked about as much as I would like to in other Final Fantasy X discussions, but this is probably the most frustrating aspect of the game, at least for me personally. Now, if there's one huge gripe that I have with Final Fantasy X, it's how the extra endgame content is handled. I feel like getting the celestial weapons, the optional side quests, and completing the other big bonus content could be way too difficult and prohibitively elusive. This is made so much worse when the game forces you to engage with things that you might not want to deal with, especially if you want to get the better equipment and abilities that you need later on. So you need Wakka's ultimate weapon to use in battles? Well then guess what? You're playing nothing but Blitzball for the next 20 hours. Oh, so you want that item to help you make a specific ability for your armor pieces, huh? Well, too bad. You're taking hours to catch every single monster of a specific type for the arena. The absolute worst offender of this is the lightning dodge minigame that you need to complete in order to get Lulu's Venus sigil for her celestial weapon. You need to dodge 200 lightning bolts in the Thunder Plains to get this thing. It's criteria like this that is just simply insane. I'm telling you, I almost never do this when I replay the game because of how frustrating it can be. Stuff like this is a huge turnoff for completing the endgame content. Seriously, it's just that annoying and it sucks to me. But that's not even scratching the surface. Bonus locations like the Omega Ruins have some of the toughest enemies in the game that will destroy you without a moment's respite. The extra bosses like the Ultima Weapon, the Dark Aeons, all of the original monsters in the arena, and the dreaded Penance will make you cry with how difficult they can be. You just need so much preparation well in advance to even stand a fraction of a chance against them, which is poorly paced throughout. I love that there's so much to do once you finish the story of the game, but a lot of it could have been massively tweaked and adjusted to make them feel a lot better to play through. I wouldn't mind the ridiculously tough fights that you could tackle if they weren't so damn frustrating to get every single thing that you need to prepare for them. Yes, I know that these things can be done. I've done just about all of them in the past, but they aren't really that fun to do is my point. I cannot begin to tell you guys just how frustrating some of that endgame content can really be, especially if you're not using the exploit in order to break the game, essentially, with the sphere grid and the leveling and getting all those moves in order to at least stand a chance against some of the things you have to deal with later on. So after everything that I've said up to this point, can I recommend that you guys check out Final Fantasy X either on PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, whatever platform you want to play it on? Should you play this game? To be honest with you, I still think that this game holds up. Even though I've criticized this game pretty heavily for a lot of the stuff that I feel like it should be criticized, this is still a fantastic experience, especially one for people that love the Final Fantasy series. There's a lot of interesting characters in here, even though they're not really the best in comparison to the rest of the series. There's still a lot of great visuals, there's still a lot of great music, there's some interesting combat and cool, neat little things you could get involved with. There's a lot of good in here that I still feel like makes this game still hold up even after all these years. If you're curious about the version of the game that I played here for this review, I actually messed around much more with the Nintendo Switch version of Final Fantasy X HD compared to some of the other versions that are out there. Some people might have preferences for which one looks a little bit better, but to me anyway, from what I saw, most of them look just about the same. The game looks as great as it's going to be even after all this time. The HD remaster music sounds fantastic, and you have the option to go back to the original soundtrack if you wanted to. If you're curious about Final Fantasy X, I highly recommend that you actually check it out and experience the fantasy and the world of Spira for yourself.
Yuna, it's time.
Well, there you go, people. That's my review of Final Fantasy X or Final Fantasy X HD Remaster. This is a game I still have a lot of resonance with. I still remember, back in those days when this came out on PlayStation 2, just sitting in front of my TV with the AC just blowing in my face and just playing this game for hours and hours, just, trying to get to the end of the story. I still think this holds up, and this is something I think a lot of other people, even if you're not into Final Fantasy like that, should experience at least one time. I feel like this is a good gateway entry for people that want to check out Final Fantasy in general. But as always, that's just my opinion about this game. Let me know what you think about this down below in the comments section. Tell me, are you a fan of Final Fantasy X? Do you think it sucks? Do you hate Final Fantasy X too? I know myself and a lot of other people don't like that game. What is some of your favorite Final Fantasy games, or one that you feel might be a better one than this as far as being a gateway game into the Final Fantasy series? Put all that stuff down below in the comments section. Thanks for watching this video, everyone. Go ahead and click the boxes on the side to see more videos and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to go visit my Patreon page for exclusive gaming content that I know you'll really love. Hope you have a chill day. Peace out and stay epic, everybody.